Hello, my name's Dr. Ben Sessa, and I'm going to record a very brief 20-minute lecture on the concept of psychedelics, the great disruptors. So, in this lecture, we're going to look at how they are disrupting what we know about the stuck narratives that underpin mental disorders due to trauma. Psychedelics also disrupt the concept of categorical diagnoses, and I'll go on to show that all psychedelics can be used for all psychiatric diagnoses. And this is also challenging how we even define and categorize psychedelic diagnostics through manuals like ICD and DSM. And it's disrupting how we carry out research. Are randomized control trials the best way to manage the effects of psychedelics? Randomized control trials frequently have difficulties with blinding when it comes to psychedelics. And are we better suited with large-scale, real-world data as a way of measuring the safety and efficacy of psychedelics? So as a challenge to the whole research industry there. Within the investment community, psychedelics are challenging the traditional models, which usually pharma industry will direct a particular compound towards a particular psychiatric indication. So when psychedelics can actually work with across transdiagnostic parameters, investors are struggling as to how to best fund psychedelic research, which has seen the growth of people looking for new molecules that they have patent in and IP for, rather than traditional drugs like psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD and ketamine, which of course are generic. And this is also challenging regulatory approval agencies like FDA and EMA and MHRA as to how they go about approving psychedelics if they are indeed going to be considered transdiagnostic. And of course, psychedelics tragically and effectively dismantle what we know about the drug laws, as psychedelics really ought not be Schedule 1 dangerous drugs of abuse. They should be in Schedules 2 and below because they are safe and they're effective as clinical treatments. So altogether, we see a huge challenge for the whole industry of psychiatry and how it is researched and funded and regulated through our use of psychedelic therapies. And the purpose of this work with psychedelics is to see psychedelics free in public health care for everyone, rather than restricted just to people who can afford them. So many ways of defining psychedelics, and depending on which discipline you approach it, whether from a sacramental, entheogenic, indigenous use perspective, or from a strictly conservative psychiatric perspective, or from a legal perspective, or from a cultural perspective. But the part that is most interesting is that these drugs are clinical and research tools. And here's the first episode of Disruption. What do we even call psychedelics? And some people would say you can't call ketamine a psychedelic, or you can't call MDMA a psychedelic. And so here we need to broaden our definition of how we classify psychedelics. The classic psychedelics would involve drugs like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, 5-MeO, DMT, and mescaline. These are 5-HT2A partial agonists. But of course, there's many other classes of drug that have psychedelic effects, including the entactogens, particularly MDMA, the dissociative anesthetics, particularly ketamine, and indeed tetrahydrocannabinol without CBD to balance it is psychedelic, and a whole host of plant medicines such as ibogaine and salvia, which are not classic psychedelics, but do have psychedelic effects. So there's the first part of disruption. We need to change our approach as to what we call psychedelics and not just restrict it to the classic psychedelics. We classify psychedelics according to their molecular structure as well, and most psychedelics fall into the tryptamines and the phenethylamines. Now, when we get into thinking about how do we use psychedelic therapies and for which psychiatric disorders, so there's some common psychiatric disorders: depression, anxiety, eating disorders, addictions, PTSD, which is an anxiety disorder, and personality disorders. Now, over the years, we have seen increasing pilot studies demonstrating safety and efficacy of psychedelics for treating these different disorders. So first we saw psilocybin being used to treat anxiety disorders, in this case Moreno's study for OCD, and we saw psilocybin being used for addictions. Bogenschutz used psilocybin to treat alcohol use disorder. Of course, the work of MAPS has focused primarily on MDMA as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. We've also seen MDMA proposed for the treatment of social anxiety disorder in adults with autism. And we've seen MDMA being used in my own study there in Bristol, using MDMA to treat alcohol use disorder. And we have now seen psilocybin proposed by Compass Pathways as a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. And we've seen psilocybin being used to treat anorexia nervosa with Meg Spriggs' study there. And we've seen psilocybin proposed for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder with Stephen Ross's work. And there are now studies in development for personality disorders with MDMA, and MDMA to treat eating disorders is also being proposed and studied at the moment, as is psilocybin to treat personality disorders, and MDMA to treat depression is a forthcoming study. So we're really broadening the pigeonholing of different compounds for different psychiatric indications. And of course, ketamine treats all of these different psychiatric disorders. So we are moving away from the pigeonholing of a certain disorder for with a certain psychedelic compound. In fact, let's strike off these disorders altogether in our psychedelic disruption of categorical diagnoses, and propose that actually all psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers of psychotherapy. And they can work for all psychiatric conditions, which does make us question our whole system of psychiatric indications and categorical diagnoses. Why is this? Well, it's probably because underpinning most long-standing psychiatric disorders in many cases is trauma. Not all cases, but the majority of chronic unremitting mental disorders. Trauma as a result of child maltreatment, abuse of different forms, causes an attachment relationship impairment and insecure attachment relationships, which become the blueprint for your adult psychological functioning. So underpinning this is attachment difficulties, whatever the psychiatric disorder, and the trauma that underpins these. And this results in a clinical stuckness. So as an illustration, if we have a child who's been exposed to disordered attachment as a result of abuse or maltreatment, this results in the formation of negative narratives. I am useless, I am a failure, I am unloved, the world is unsafe. And this can develop into any one of the psychiatric disorders, and we traditionally pigeonhole people into these different categorical diagnoses, and then we traditionally treat them with primarily symptom-based treatments. If they're depressed, we give them an antidepressant. If they can't sleep, we give them a hypnotic. If their mood goes up and down, we give them a mood stabilizer. If their hypervigilance spills over into paranoia, we give them antipsychotics, or we give them benzodiazepines to manage daytime anxiety. And these are substandard treatments with symptom-based maintenance drugs that need to be taken every day just to mask the symptoms, and also substandard psychotherapies that many people can't access. And this is a very sad state of affairs and results in clinical stuckness and these disorders becoming lifelong, untreatable, unremitting disorders that we just manage with symptomatic relief with daily maintenance drugs. So where do psychedelics come into this very sad picture? Well, psychedelics are, in my opinion, the most innovative form of psychopharmacology that we've had for 100 years in psychiatry, because they allow us to disrupt the stuckness that comes from the formation of narratives as a result of child maltreatment. Now, there's different ways of looking at how we do this. The entropic brain theory is as such. If we imagine the bedroom there on the left, a highly organized state, that requires a lot of energy. It's a low state of entropy. It's highly organized. Everything's tidied away. If you just allow the natural forces of nature to take place with that bedroom and you don't tidy it up, it moves towards the bedroom on the right, as many students may recognize. And in the brain theory, what we have here is that highly organized bedroom is analogous to very rigid and narrow thinking, ruminations that underpin depression, OCD, anxiety, PTSD, and certainly addictions, which are maintained by rigid narratives as a result of child maltreatment and abuse. And then a much more chaotic brain state would be, as we see in dream states, infant consciousness, and indeed psychedelic states. Now, you may say, who would want to live in that highly chaotic bedroom? Well, the answer is nobody would want to live in that all the time. But if we look at this analogous to brain function, and this is the famous picture from Robin Carhart Harris's work, with on placebo there, that's normal brain functioning, we see some degree of connectivity within regions and a very small amount of connectivity between brain regions. And then in the psilocybin state, there's a huge opening of network connectivity both within and particularly between regions. And this is analogous to that chaotic bedroom in which anything is possible. Now, again, you couldn't live in that state all the time. But if you're used to a highly organized, restrictive, rigid state of mind or brain, then those few precious hours in the psilocybin state opens up therapeutic opportunities. And the words that we're hearing more and more these days are these words of neuroplasticity, neuroflexibility, and the concept of therapeutic windows. And whether it's MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, or ketamine, we're seeing every month new papers coming out demonstrating that for a few brief hours, these drugs, all of them, allow this open window of therapeutic opportunity in which, with focused psychotherapy, we can actually tackle the rigid narratives that result in the sustaining of mental disorders into becoming chronic unremitting mental health problems. So let's take 3 different drugs here: psilocybin, ketamine, and MDMA. As we know, these all have different biological effects. Psilocybin has been shown to impair the default mode network through this increased network connectivity, reducing the rumination and rigidity of certain brain states that underpin depression in particular. Ketamine, we know, induces protein synthesis and has new dendritic growth, again, resulting in increased neural network connectivity. And MDMA, slightly different activity, impairs the amygdala, and that allows you to approach and tackle rigid negative memories which underpin trauma. So 3 different drugs, 3 different psychological experiences, 3 different modes of action biologically, but they all take us to the same place. For a few brief hours, we have this biological window of opportunity opened, this sense of neuroplasticity. And if we hit the patient at that point with bespoke focused psychotherapy during this window of opportunity, we have this opportunity to tackle rigid narratives and allow for psychological change. Now, this is fundamental, and this is what underpins all of those 3 very different drugs there, this biological window of opportunity. So how do we work within that window of opportunity? We work within the drug state to allow the patient to safely and comfortably access repressed memories, tackle those rigid narratives, loosen the ego, access the unconscious, and in support with non-drug preparation sessions and non-drug integration sessions in real time, we can see that loosening of narratives and allow the patient to reboot, defrag, and rebrand that mental state of rigidity that is leaving them stuck in lifelong mental disorders. And of course, all psychedelic protocols have a similar structure of both drug and non-drug sessions. And most of the drug sessions, whether it's MDMA, ketamine, or psilocybin, the talk therapy is relatively minimal. Most of the work takes place in the non-drug sessions, and it's in the drug sessions through the use of music, headphones, eye shades, that the patient is experiencing being with the drug experience, allowing the medicine to work, and then the talk therapy takes place at other sessions. And it's the integration that is so crucial. Psychedelic drugs are extremely safe. This is David Nutt's famous Delphic analysis table of 20 drugs listed according to harm to self and others. And there's the psychedelics languishing at the bottom. We know that these drugs have very low toxicity. Indeed, psilocybin has such low toxicity that you would need to eat 17 kilograms of fresh magic mushrooms in order to reach the lethal dose in 50% of people with the toxicity of psilocybin. And incidentally, what does 17 kilograms of fresh mushrooms look like? Well, there's one 200 milligram box of mushrooms from the supermarket. You would need to eat 85 of those boxes of fresh magic mushrooms to get anywhere near the toxicity for psilocybin. So remarkably safe drugs. And indeed, we are now in this psychedelic renaissance. Why are we in this renaissance now? Well, Time is one of the reasons. A lot of water has passed under the bridge since the 1960s. People don't even know who Timothy Leary was these days, the young people. And psychedelic researchers these days are less obsessed with changing the world. We're avoiding the hyperbole, and we're using science to convince authorities. A lot of this renaissance is a result of new scientific methods, using nice pretty pictures of neuroimaging like functional MRI and MEG, which gives a more sciencey angle and allows people to understand what's actually happening with the drugs in ways we didn't understand in the 50s, 60s and 70s. But also we're moving away from the cultural argument. We're not trying to change the world with psychedelics. We're just trying to provide good, safe, effective mental health treatments. And this carries a lot more weight in pushing forward this renaissance. But I think it's patient power that's the main reason why we've moved forward with this renaissance in the last 20 years. Patients themselves are tired of these daily maintenance drug therapies that don't work and just mask symptoms. And the technology of psychedelics in opening that window of opportunity, inducing this newer flexibility, really do tackle these rigid narratives in ways that we haven't been able to do before. As a result, we've seen this huge network of activity, not only within the brains, but within culture, in which we've seen psychedelic societies, conferences and festivals that really have absolutely eclipsed the 60s. So people talk about the psychedelic 60s. Really, today's psychedelic community is far more psychedelic than it was in the 60s. There are far more recreational users than ever before, far more conferences, festivals, and we're seeing psychedelic societies crop up all over the world. And of course, psychedelics are not just involved in psychotherapy and psychology and psychiatry, but also botany, chemistry, law, politics, design, music, philosophy. They branch out to all aspects of culture. Now, an important thing for people who are interested in the world of psychedelics, this is not a fringe subject. I was told very early in my career that this would be career suicide. Far from it. This is where cutting-edge psychiatry and neuroscience is today. It's with psychedelics. So if you are a young person watching this and your tutor has said to you this is career suicide, ask your tutor quite respectfully to just read the journals they prescribe to. These journals, these institutions, King's, Cardiff, Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard, UCLA, UCL, Johns Hopkins, the Lancet, the BMJ, these are not fringe institutions. All of these places are now running psychedelic research studies. This is the cutting edge of modern psychiatry. So get involved. And a few words about some of the conferences. We now have multiple international psychedelic conferences. I was the co-founder of one in the UK called Breaking Convention. We've had 6 different gatherings so far with up to 1,500 people. The MAPS conferences in the States, just came back from the Denver one with 12,000 attendees. And then, of course, all countries all over the world now have got their psychedelic conferences. So get involved with the international psychedelic conference scene. We have psychedelic festivals, which focus primarily on the psychedelic experience through the use of music. And what's interesting about these festivals is that these are also good opportunities for psychedelic emergency groups like The Loop, Zendo Project, PsyCare, Dance Safe, providing a platform for people to safely use psychedelic drugs and manage psychedelic emergencies. And they're also a good training ground for people interested in becoming psychedelic therapists. So great attention is being paid to safe and effective psychedelic experiences. Of course, all over the world, we have psychedelic societies. In the UK, every single city has its own psychedelic society now, where people will get together and talk about new papers that are being released and invite speakers to talk to local people, usually students and young people who are interested in psychedelics. Get involved with your local psychedelic society. These are the UK ones. In the States and Canada, we also have multiple psychedelic societies all over the country, where people get together and discuss psychedelic research and their safe use of psychedelics. So these are very much a harm minimization strategy. Similarly, globally, all over the world, most major countries have got psychedelic societies, even if they don't have psychedelic research ongoing. And of course, in recent times, we've seen an explosion in the psychedelic landscape of startup communities. This isn't my slide. I must compliment Atlas Consulting for putting this together. We have a plethora of new psychedelic startups. And of course, there's some challenges with this. People are looking at new chemical entities, and they're looking at intellectual property and new molecules in order to make money and revenue. This is a challenge for the industry going forward. We need to make sure these drugs are available free on public healthcare, not just for rich people who can afford them, to satisfy shareholders. Some of the other challenges are using microdosing, which I won't cover in this lecture. Also, the idea of non-psychedelic psychedelics. Some people fear this, saying that this is taking away some of the magic of psychedelics. I would disagree. I think if we can come up with new analogues or syntheses of psychedelics that have anti-inflammatory effects, analgesic effects, or even neuroprotective effects without the psychedelic experience, that increases accessibility to more people. We will always still have the psychedelics if you want a trip, but if you want to take the psychedelic without the trip for your knee pain or your back pain or for your multiple sclerosis or for your Alzheimer's, when we get to this point, that's a great accessibility. So do not fear the growth of non-psychedelic psychedelics. We're not going to lose psychedelics just because we also have non-trip psychedelics. The important thing is tackling the political issues that hold back psychedelics, and part of this is around the war on drugs and changing the national and international domestic guidelines on the use of drugs so these are more accessible. We have to come out of our echo chamber within the psychedelic community and realize that most people out there don't understand psychedelics, and we need to find the right language to show people the benefits of psychedelics. We also urgently need to tackle transcultural diversity issues and safeguarding issues to make sure that people have confidence in psychedelic therapies, and we need to make sure that psychedelic pharma is ethically run. And this is also about getting this into free public healthcare through encouraging insurance companies and publicly funded free public healthcare for all. And a final example of psychedelic disruption comes from what's happened here in Australia, where we've been waiting for MAPS to get MDMA approved, and we're waiting for Compass to get psilocybin approved. And meanwhile, people have been starting multiple ketamine infusion clinics and a few less ketamine-assisted psychotherapy clinics. And whilst all this has been going on, suddenly, out of the blue, Australia gets granted its license for MDMA and psilocybin in July 2023. And now, for the first time anywhere in the world, MDMA and psilocybin can be used as treatments, not in research, but as treatments. So this is a wonderful example of psychedelic disruption. And hats off to the Australian government through the TGA for approving this decision that allows Australian doctors, nurses, therapists, clinical psychologists and pharmacists to start using psychedelic treatments. And not only will this increase access to more patients, but it's also going to create a large data set of real-world data to challenge this concept of randomized control trials being the only way to manage the safety, to measure the safety and efficacy of psychedelics, to move them towards approval. So well done, Australia, and that's where we are right now. Many books to look at. There's some classic old psychedelic books of the 50s and 60s. They're certainly worth looking at. And also a host of new psychedelic books in recent years, which is a demonstration of this huge improvement and increase psychedelic renaissance which is going on now. So thank you for listening. Sorry I had to be so quick with that, but let's hope this throws open some questions that we can debate in further sessions. Thank you very much.